Hey guys, our project is on doing a regular RDL, and I am going to start off by showing you guys what the starting and end position should be for a good correct RDL. In my starting position, we have my midfoot/ankle, no change from anatomical position. With my knee, there's no change, neutral from anatomical position. Hips, we have extension, but still in the anatomical position. Lumbar and thoracic spine, no change, neutral from anatomical position. My shoulders, slight flexion, and adduction, and a little bit of internal rotation. Elbows are extended and wrists are pronated. And my range of motion for these movements is knee flexion is 0 to 35 degrees. Ankle dorsiflexion is neutral. Hip flexion is 0 to 120 degrees. And thoracolumbar flexion is 1.5 centimeters at the end position. And at the end position of my movement, we have midfoot and ankles are slightly inverted, knees are slightly flexed, hips are slightly flexed and internally rotated, lumbar and thoracic spine are in slight flexion but remains sort of neutral from anatomical position. Shoulders are in slight flexion and adduction and horizontal adduction. Wrists have slight radial deviation, pronation, and slight extension. Elbows remains the same.
This is a slow motion video of the motion being done correctly. This motion has no compensations. It is just a standard decent form for an RDL, and you can clearly see what's happening at each joint once it's slowed down. You can specifically see that my shoulders are going into slight flexion. My elbows stay extended throughout the entire motion. My wrists and ankles are neutral. I have a hip hinge and flexion in my hip, and my spine remains neutral.
When comparing my motion to a properly performed RDL, my motion is far closer to a squat. This is due to my low back pain. In order to avoid aggravating that pain, I then start flexing my trunk. When I perform that motion, I also exhibit a normal amount of hip flexion for an RDL. But as we go down the kinetic chain, the amount of knee flexion I have is about 122 degrees instead of a normal 35. This means that the quad muscles are activating far more than they need to, while the glutes and hamstrings are not as active. Lastly, there is a small amount of ankle dorsiflexion of about 20 degrees instead of remaining neutral. All of these compensations lead to my weight being shifted forward. Overall, the patient's back pain creates too much stress at the hip and the knee for this to be a proper RDL. All of these changes are completely absent when we perform a normal motion.
This is an example of an incorrect RDL. You can see that I am clearly not hinging at the hips and do not have a bend in my knee. Slight external rotation in my hips causing my ankles to evert. This compensation could be due to retroversion in my angle of torsion at the hip. My knee joints do not bend at all in this motion, which is due to weak hamstring muscles and tight quadriceps. This would be an example of active insufficiency of the quads since they're in knee extension, and passive insufficiency of the hamstrings since they are at their longest or at the most stretch. My ankles are in slight plantar flexion when I'm bending backwards, fully extending my knee, but otherwise they remain pretty neutral, not really dorsiflex and not really plantar flex. My heels aren't coming off the floor.
Here we have our last abnormality. As you can see, I start my RDL in a normal neutral position. But things get ugly quickly. As I start going down, my back flexes excessively, specifically at the thoracolumbar region. This is a compensation due to weak hamstrings and glutes that prevent my hips from being able to extend and my knees from slightly flexing. This would be a prime example of poor lumbopelvic rhythm. Since there is no hip hinge, the lower back compensates by going into flexion. We measured 12 centimeters of thoracolumbar flexion, which is far too much for an RDL, as our example was only 1.5 centimeters of thoracolumbar flexion. During a normal lumbopelvic rhythm, there would be simultaneous movement between the hips and the back. But since this is not happening, it can increase stress on the back over time and even lead to serious injuries.
Thank you for watching, and we hope you enjoyed.